Hi, my name is Eric Toller. I want to thank you for joining for our discussion of biblical leadership based on the Torah, that is the five books of Moses, focusing on the mission. And we approach it on a weekly basis based on the Parsha, that is the portion of the Torah that Jews read every week to complete the entire five books on a yearly cycle. Welcome to those returning, and welcome to those who are joining for the first time. Of course, I appreciate if you like the video and also if you subscribe. I plan on doing this, God willing, every week, and I look forward to your comments, suggestions, and discussions. So first, let's just remind ourselves of the approach we're taking overall. As I mentioned in the first video last week, this is building on a book that I published last year in 2024 that looked at biblical leadership itself based on the Torah. And what we came up with at the end was that we want to develop ourselves, and so we need a leadership development plan if we're actually going to become the leaders that we want to become. And how do we know to put that plan together? Well, we have to back up and we have to think of what are the leadership profiles, what are the leadership attributes that we want to incorporate. Okay? And where do we get these attributes? We get these attributes from thinking, what is our value proposition? What value will we bring to the world that either doesn't exist or doesn't adequately exist? Now, all these three parts were all discussed extensively in the book, but there's one part missing, and that is, how do we know what value we should be bringing, either as mankind or as Jews? Well, we need to understand the mission, and that is what we hope to discuss in the coming weeks as we look through each parsha. So this week's parsha is Parshas Balak. It is in the book of Bamidbar, or Numbers. It's the fourth book of the Torah. It's the seventh parsha in this book. Now, this is a very interesting story that takes place here, and it has two, maybe three main characters. One is Balak, who is the king of Moab. One is Bilam, who is the prophet, probably the biggest prophet of the time, even as big as Moshe, we're told. And the third is Bilam's donkey. We're not going to talk much about Bilam's donkey, or if at all, except for the fact that if you remember the story, Bilam's donkey actually opened his mouth and spoke to Bilam and told him what he was doing was wrong. So let's start with Balak. Who is this guy Balak? Now, Balak is a bad, bad dude. He was king, and he was a powerful leader. But the question is, how did he get to be such a powerful leader? So what we learn from the opening verses, the opening pasukim of this, is Vayar Balak ben Tzipor es kol asher asach Yisrael lehem Emorim. Balak, he saw what the Jews had done, what the Israelites had done to the Amorites. They had conquered them. And was he really scared? Probably not. I think we know that he really had nothing to fear, but he realized that he could get the people, the Moabites, to be scared and unify them against the Israelites as a potential threat. Now, this is one of the lessons that we will be talking about in the future many times over, that there are two ways to unify people with regard to a mission. One is to unify them against something, the same way Moses originally unified the Jews against Paro, against Pharaoh, the most powerful man at the time. And the other way is to unify people for something, for a mission. Now, the take-home lesson, which we will learn over the coming weeks, over the coming year, is that unifying against something has no legacy. It can't go on forever. You can't continuing on unifying people on a mission, fighting against someone or fearing someone. You can only unify them if you have a common mission of what you want to do. So we see that Balak was using the less than ideal way to unify the people, and we're actually told from our sages that he actually wasn't even king before this. He just manipulated the people to become king. And in the end, this turns out to be very disastrous, um, not only for him, but his people. And we'll talk about that perhaps more in the next parsha in Pinchas, on what his people were actually willing to do to try to undermine God's chosen people, the Jews. So, despite the fact that Balak was this very evil person, we see that we can still learn something very powerful from him, and thus understand perhaps why we would name a whole parsha against him. So what about this other character, Bilam? Now, as I said, Bilam was a prophet, a non-Jewish prophet, and he could have used his prophetic abilities to raise the non-Jewish world to a spiritual level previously unseen. And we're told that his prophecy was on the same level as Moses himself. But what did he do? He did not use it that way. He chose a very different way, and he himself ended up with a very disastrous outcome. We won't have time to discuss that today, but please look into it yourselves. So what do we see here? What can we learn from Bilam? Why is Bilam included in this story? Well, we can learn some very important things from him. First of all, how do we know how evil he is? Well, Balak wanted to enlist Bilam as a high level prophet to actually curse the Jews because he knew of his abilities. So he sent dignitaries, and Bilam said no. And then he sent some more dignitaries, and Bilam said no. Right? And eventually he does go. So how do we know that Bilam is so bad? Well, one of the things that seems like perhaps a benign phrase here is in the 18th pasuk, in the 18th verse. We see that when he finally says yes, what does he do? He gets up in the morning and he saddles his own donkey. Why is this significant? Bilam is this high-level guy. And we see later in the parsha that he has people running around doing all kinds of things for him, much more complicated and difficult than this. But he saddles his own donkey. So what does this say? That says that when he finally decided to accept money from this bad guy Balak to go and potentially curse the Jews, that he was so eager that he didn't even wait for one of his own servants. Can we learn anything else about the mission that we have as mankind, in particular as Jews, from Bilam? We can. As pointed out by the Rav, we see something very interesting. As I said, Balak sent two sets of emissaries to try to convince Bilam to come with him. He said no to the first, and then he sent a second, even higher level, maybe Balak's leadership team, perhaps, as we would say in today's vernacular. But how are they referred to in the Torah according to Bilam? He calls the first ones nobles, the first emissaries nobles. Okay, they were nobles, fine. But then the second team, who were even higher level, the Torah says they were higher level. What does he call them? Avdei Balak, servants of Balak. So what does that tell us? That tells us that if we can accept that our mission is to be Avdei Hashem, to be a servant of Hashem, we realize that we have to be on the same level as those second set of emissaries, the highest level you can be, who are concerned about nothing else than the person they're serving, in our case, Hashem. So with that, we'll close, and I wish you all Besoros Tovos, Shabbat Shalom. If you like, please like. If you subscribe, please subscribe. And I look forward to continue this discussion next week.